So to make sure everybody's with us here, these guidelines are not what RFK Jr. wants.
That's right. He's not in there yet.
So the food fight is, are you thinking that RFK Jr. is going to disagree with these guidelines?
So yeah, so what I'm doing is I'm setting up here what is the food fight, and I'm saying some of this I'm hoping that he's going
Mm.
to take on this fight. We're talking about food politics again. Yay. So today we're unpacking what may turn out to be the food fight of the century. That's what they're calling it. So we all know that Robert Kennedy Jr. has this ambitious vision of helping to make America healthy again. He wants to do things like overhaul the school lunches, ban certain pesticides, tackle ultra processed food, and the corporate influence in public health. He's put forth proposals that some are saying could actually revolutionize how we live and how we eat. And others are saying, or it could do nothing, right? So, so to be successful in making these changes that he wants, he's going to have to fight the powerful food and ag lobbies, right? And we both know how powerful these lobbies are. He's also going to have to overcome resistance from industries that are benefiting from the status quo. And we'll talk about some of those today because they are involved with the dietary guidelines. So Kennedy's fight has already begun, even though he has not even been confirmed yet. And it's beginning with these dietary guidelines. So these guidelines are issued every 5 years, and it's time for them to be renewed again. They influence everything from school lunch programs to federal food assistance policies like SNAP foods, meals for the elderly. They influence what's on your food label. They influence which studies are going to be funded, which ingredients companies use to make the processed foods that we eat. And Kennedy has expressed a desire to actually overhaul these dietary guidelines. In one part, he wants to prioritize whole, unprocessed foods over the ultra processed foods, and he also wants to get rid of the basically this corporate influence, this industry influence that has historically existed in these guidelines. So the question remains of, can Kennedy actually make any meaningful change? And the answer is complex. I want to get into this today with you, Joel. As I said, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, they have prepared their initial report. So just so everyone's up to speed, there's a Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. They prepare a report, and usually this is 20 or less people on this committee. And they come together, they analyze data, and they provide their guidance. And that guidance serves to advise the Health and Human Services and the USDA secretaries, right? So if Kennedy gets put into that position, he'll be the Health and Human Services secretary. So he will, in part, oversee these guidelines along with the USDA secretary. They together finalize those guidelines. So this is his chance to go ahead.
Let me make sure we don't. I want to bring everybody along with us here because this is an ongoing story, and it's a very exciting story. We haven't seen this level of food discussion in our lifetimes, and I think that right there when you said whole unprocessed over ultra processed, you have harped and harped and harped on the fact that that food scientists do not recognize the difference between processed and unprocessed. All they recognize is fat, saturated fat, whatever, sugar, salt, or I don't know. I'm over my pay grade here, but they categorize foods into these very simplistic categories. There's never been a recognition between processed versus unprocessed. It's only within these nutritional or calories, fat, kind of things, and so this is such an earthquake departure from thinking, to think in terms of whole foods versus break everything down in little categories.
Yeah. So to build on what you're saying, in case someone needs some clarity, is that yeah, when we're taught in nutrition about foods, we break them down into their individual components, like a calorie. And we talked about this on the podcast before, that we're taught a calorie is a calorie. So broccoli is a carbohydrate, okay, and primarily a carbohydrate, and so is soda. Soda is primarily a carbohydrate, and so we don't look at that a calorie from a soda is going to react differently. It's going to be metabolized differently. It's going to create different hormones, for instance, and neurotransmitters in your body than a calorie from broccoli, right? Your body's going to see a calorie from broccoli different than it's going to see a calorie from soda. And
Yeah.
so that's what Joel is saying, is that historically we have not taken that into context. We group them all as calories, like Weight Watchers, you count calories, right? We all know about calorie counting. And this is what's on the nutrition facts panel that's on the foods that you eat, that the dietary guidelines are basically advising what's on that nutrition facts panel. And it's just calories. It just says calories. It just says fat. So that's not differentiating between, okay, is this fat coming from animal meat, or is this fat coming from a highly processed industrial seed oil? You're not going to see that on the nutrition facts panel. Just like protein, you're not going to see this came from a regenerative farm, or this protein came from industrial feedlot where the cows were standing in manure and fed grains. Like, they don't differentiate between that. And that, I think, Joel, that's what you're talking about, I believe. And
Yeah.
so we're a lot of us in this food space are now excited because Kennedy is bringing forth a lot of these issues and people are listening. Like, my girlfriend was telling me her 20-something-year-old son the other day came up to her at the table and was like, hey, Kennedy said that this soda is bad. Like, there's stuff in it that's bad. And she's in this food space and she's told him that for years, but she had to sit there and be like, okay, I'm not going to have my ego, like, poked. I'm going to be like, yes, he's right. That is bad. And I'm glad that you're paying attention. Like, so Kennedy is making, even though nothing has changed yet in terms of rules and regulations, dietary guidelines, he's making a big splash already, because especially for you and I, what matters most is we move the market. And to do that, first you have to educate, and then you have to empower and encourage. So he is helping like leaps and bounds in educating at this point. Okay. So I love that. And I love where you're going with this. So let's jump into some of this and see what we think, and what these new proposals really mean. And are they actually getting any better? Like, have they made any notable changes since the 2020 guidelines? Okay, so let's just go through some of the changes here. And again, these are proposed changes, okay, from the committee. So one of the notable changes is they want to modify the order of protein foods in order to emphasize plant sources. So for instance, I'm comparing the 2020 guideline with the 2025, new recommendations. So in the 2020 guidelines and before, under proteins, you have meat listed first. Okay, it's usually meat and then like seafood, and then it's nuts, seeds, soy products. Okay. Now what they want to do is flip it and put meat last. So they want to put nuts, seeds, and soy products first, followed by seafood, and then that's followed by meat, poultry, or eggs. So even just the order in which they're listing sources of protein, they want to de-emphasize meat, poultry, and eggs. They want to prioritize things like peas, beans, and lentils, and they want to reclassify them entirely as proteins instead of vegetables. I didn't know how you felt about that, but that's a pretty big change. It might seem kind of, like benign, but these guidelines do shape our perception of food. They're taught to us at a very young age in school. And so they are actually reframing the way that we think of food. And now what they want people to think is that the primary source of protein is going to be from nuts, seeds, and soy. And then also to think of
That sounds like that doesn't sound like a positive change to me. Because
well, if you're
not
vegetarian or vegan, then that would
yeah.
be a positive change.
And if you think cow burps and farts are going to put us all into extinction in 30 years, that's a good change. But from a nutritional, and you can speak to this better than I, but from a nutritional standpoint and a complete a complete balanced nutritional standpoint, the meat, poultry, and eggs. I mean, if you think for a minute that soy milk is comparable to grass-fed cow milk, or that sunflowers are as fully nutritious as a egg, you got another thing coming.
Yeah. Well, and see, as nutritionists, we're taught that those categories like nuts, seeds, soy, and then the beans and the lentils, these are classified as incomplete proteins. They don't have the complete complement of the essential amino acids that the body requires. You can combine them, right? You can combine like the beans with a tortilla shell and create that complement of amino acids that are required for the body. So it's not that you can't meet all of your protein requirements. It's just harder, and it requires a little more thought into your meal planning. So I'm not against that. I mean, I don't think either one of us is against anyone making a decision for themselves if they want to be vegan or vegetarian. As you know, I used to be. So I'm not saying that whatsoever. What I'm saying is that now these are supposed to be the national dietary guidelines, and they have a worldwide influence, and they do affect all of us. And so now what they're doing is promoting incomplete sources of protein over complete sources of protein. And there is some concern that this could increase the risk for micronutrient deficiencies in our country and across the world. We're already seeing micronutrient deficiencies on the rise. As you know, I was borderline for beriberi and pellagra, which both of those are deficiencies that were diseases that were eradicated at least by the mid 1900s. And we're seeing a resurgence of these. I'm not the only one suffered from that. So one concern is that they are creating micronutrient deficiencies, specifically because of that swap. And also they're recommending 6 daily servings of grain and 3 of refined grains. So the limit is 3 of refined grains. But there's been health concerns about refined carbohydrates, yet they're still in the guidelines. So this is getting into Kennedy's point that we have these ultra processed foods that are still allowed in the guidelines. And so even if you just think of those 2 changes and those 2 promotions, so like we still have ultra processed food that are okay. We're still saying that refined grains are okay. Yeah, limit them, but they're still okay. And now we're saying we're putting on a pedestal these incomplete sources of protein. It can potentially lead to more nutrient deficiencies. Right. It says that they're suggesting further cutting weekly meat, poultry, and egg intake by an additional 3.5 to 4 ounces compared to the previous recommendations. So that's roughly the size of a deck of cards or the palm of your hand. So they're advising, again, to limit the overall red meat consumption. And while they're doing that, they're also saying
is that per day, 3.4 to 3.5 ounces per day.
Yeah, well, they're saying per week to
per
further
week?
Cut weekly by an additional 3.5 to 4 ounces. So over a week, just in 1 week, cut more of it out. Cut about 3.5 to 4 ounces more out. So cut more out. And they're saying here, let me get to the exact page. I will link this 185-page PowerPoint in case anybody wants to look at it for themselves. That's not even the written document. This is just the PowerPoint. I will link this so you can see it. I'm on page 127 right now. So again, they want to limit saturated fat intake to less than 10% of calories per day. And they're saying that this has been consistent over time, that the dietary guidelines has recommended limiting saturated fat intake since the first edition in 1980. And The quantitative recommendation has been consistent since it was introduced in 2005. So they're saying it was confirmed by several dietary guidelines advisory committees that saturated fat intake could increase cardiovascular disease risk. So now, so previous advisory committees, which we know a lot of them have ties to industry, and I'll get into that more in a minute, they confirmed that saturated fat could lead to cardiovascular disease. So we're going to continue with that and tell you to still limit saturated fat intake. Mm-hmm. And in the meanwhile, low fat is being debunked everywhere. There's an article that popped up. I went into Google, and it pops up news for you. It actually popped up this article out of the Atlantic talking about that we've been duped by the low fat craze. So that everyone's catching on to it, and yet the guidelines are still pushing this. Stop eating so much red meat and limit your intake of saturated fat. Basically, if you don't want to die of a heart attack, is what they're saying. They also, in terms of the fat, on page 124, they're saying milk consumption should be fat-free and low-fat dairy milks and unsweetened fortified soy beverages. So again, fat-free, low-fat, again. This also then will fit into this concern that some of us are having about nutrient deficiencies that could possibly develop from these guidelines. So you're taking out the animal fat, right? You're taking out the animal meat. Now you're taking out the animal fat, right? Now you're taking out the fat in the milk. You're leaving in the ultra processed foods.